There are moments in history that sound too cinematic to be real. Moments where the wrong man walks into the wrong room at exactly the wrong time, and the entire world seems to hold its breath. This is one of those moments. A casino floor thick with cigarette smoke and the low murmur of dangerous men. Green felt tables glowing under chandelier light. The distant clink of glasses, the shuffle of cards, and underneath it all, the quiet hum of something that could only be described as controlled menace. And then the doors swung open, and John Wayne walked in. Not metaphorically, not in some fictionalized Hollywood retelling. The man himself, 6'4", broad as a barn door, wearing a leather vest and a blue bandana around his neck, like he'd just ridden it off the range, walked into a casino that belonged to people who made men disappear for far lesser offenses than what he was about to do. The crowd parted, heads turned, and in the span of about 30 seconds, John Wayne did something that no one in that room, in that city, or in that entire industry had ever dared to do. He walked up to the most powerful man in the building, and he slapped him, open-handed, in front of everybody. And standing just a few feet away, watching the whole thing unfold with a cigarette between his fingers and an expression caught somewhere between amusement and absolute disbelief, was Dean Martin. What happened next would echo through Hollywood for decades. But to understand why John Wayne did what he did, and why it mattered so much more than just one slap in a smoky room, you have to go back. You have to understand the world these men were living in, a world where the line between entertainment and organized crime was not just blurred, it was practically invisible. By the late 1950s, Las Vegas was not the gleaming corporate playground it would eventually become. It was something rawer, darker, and infinitely more dangerous. The casinos that lined the Strip were not simply businesses. They were monuments to power. And the men who owned them, really owned them, not just on paper, were not the kind of men who appeared in press releases. They were men with names that got spoken in whispers. Men whose reach extended from the gambling floors of Nevada all the way to the back rooms of Chicago, New York, and Miami. Men who had built this desert kingdom out of cash skimmed from legitimate businesses, enforced by violence, and protected by a web of political corruption so deep it would take federal investigators decades to even begin to untangle it. Hollywood had always had a complicated relationship with these men. The studio system was powerful, yes, but the mob had fingers in unions, in distribution networks, in the supply chains that kept productions running. Certain producers knew which phone calls to answer and which ones to let ring. Certain directors understood that some locations were available and some were not, and that asking too many questions about why it was bad for your health. The entertainment world and the underworld were not separate universes. They shared geography, they shared money, and they shared people. Most notably, they shared Las Vegas. Dean Martin understood this world perhaps better than almost anyone. He had grown up in Steubenville, Ohio, a steel town where mob influence was simply part of the civic furniture. As a young man, he dealt cards, run numbers, done small favors for men who never needed to explain why. By the time he became one of the most famous entertainers on earth, he had not forgotten where he came from. And more importantly, the men who ran certain establishments had not forgotten either. There was a mutual understanding, a kind of unspoken agreement. Dean could perform at their venues. He could drink at their bars. He could walk into their casinos and be treated like royalty. And in return, Dean would smile, he would sing, he would keep his mouth shut about the things he saw, and he would never, under any circumstances, cause a problem. John Wayne operated by a completely different set of rules. Or more accurately, John Wayne operated by his own rules, and only his own rules. And anyone who had a problem with that was welcome to take it up with him personally. The story begins, as so many of the best ones do, with a film. The production was called The Rat Race, though in some corners of Hollywood it was being called something far less printable. And it was a kind of project that seemed simple on paper but had become extraordinarily complicated in execution. Wayne was involved through a series of contractual obligations that he had inherited from a business deal gone sideways, the details of which would take longer to explain than the story itself warrants. What matters is that the project required shooting certain scenes in Las Vegas. And Las Vegas, as we have established, was controlled by men who had opinions about what got filmed on their turf and what didn't. The specific casino in question was owned, through a series of shell companies and holding groups that would have required a forensic accountant and a significant amount of courage to trace, by a man we'll call the Don, because his real name is less important than what he represented. He was not physically imposing. He was short, thick through the middle, wore suits that cost more than most Americans made in a month, and had the kind of pale, watchful eyes that made you feel as though you were being quietly assessed for either profit or liability, and that the decision between those two outcomes was entirely his to make. He had built his piece of the Las Vegas empire through a combination of genuine business acumen and absolutely catastrophic violence. Men who had crossed him had not simply lost their investments. They had lost considerably more than that. The Don had agreed, conditionally, to allow the production to use his casino floor for filming. The conditions were, to put it mildly, extensive. There were restrictions on which angles could be captured, which employees could appear on camera, which areas of the building were off limits, and which members of the crew were allowed on the premises. There were financial arrangements that had been negotiated in meetings that did not appear on any official production schedule. And there was an understanding, communicated not in writing but with perfect clarity, that the production would cooperate fully with any requests made by the casino's management, regardless of how those requests might affect the shooting schedule. Wayne had agreed to these conditions the way he agreed to most things he found disagreeable. He signed the papers, said nothing, and then proceeded to do exactly what he intended to do all along. This was not stubbornness. Exactly. It was something more fundamental than that. John Wayne had grown up watching his father, a quiet and dignified man who had been crushed by circumstances and other people's power, and he had made a decision somewhere in the marrow of his bones that he would never be that man. He would never be the one who bent. He would never be the one who looked away. It was both his greatest quality and, on certain occasions, his most catastrophic flaw. Dean Martin was on the project because Dean Martin was everywhere in those years. He had recently separated professionally from Jerry Lewis, a split that had been described by the press as the entertainment equivalent of an atomic bomb, and he had emerged from the wreckage not wounded but somehow more luminous than before. He was starring in films, recording albums that went gold before they finished pressing, and performing at venues across the country to audiences who treated him with something approaching religious devotion. He was also, in ways that were both personal and professional, deeply embedded in the world of Las Vegas in ways that Wayne was not. Dean had been brought on to this particular production partly for his marquee value, and partly because his existing relationships with the casino's ownership were expected to smooth the inevitable friction that came with having John Wayne anywhere near a set. The thinking was sound. What the producers had failed to account for was that Dean Martin's approach to friction was not to prevent it, but to manage it after it occurred, preferably from a comfortable distance with a drink in his hand. The day it happened was a Tuesday. This detail feels almost absurdly mundane given what followed, but it matters because Tuesdays at the casino were slow. The high rollers came on weekends. The celebrities, the politicians, the various luminaries whose presence gave the place its particular glamour, they came when the crowds were there to see them. On a Tuesday afternoon, the casino floor was populated mostly by serious gamblers, people who came for the game itself rather than the spectacle, and the staff, who moved through the room with the quiet efficiency of people who had seen everything and would deny having seen any of it. The film crew had been set up near the blackjack tables on the east side of the floor. The lighting rigs cast long shadows across the green felt. The cameras were positioned according to a setup that had been approved, reluctantly, by the Don's people. And John Wayne was standing at the center of it all, not in character, not yet filming, but having what could be generously described as a discussion with the Don's floor manager about a particular shot that Wayne felt was essential to the scene and that the floor manager had been told, in no uncertain terms, to prevent. The floor manager, a compact, nervous man named Eddie who had been in the Don's employ for 11 years and who had survived in that position precisely because he understood which battles were worth fighting and which were not, was explaining, for the third time, that the camera could not be positioned in front of the private corridor that led to the Don's offices. The reasons he gave were practical. Fire code, liability. The shot would interfere with the flow of customers. Each reason was, transparently, not the real reason. The real reason was that the corridor in question led to rooms where things happened that were not compatible with being captured on film by a major Hollywood production. Wayne listened to each explanation with the particular patience of a man who is not actually listening at all, but is simply waiting for the other person to finish, so he can say what he was already going to say. Then he told Eddie, in language that was direct and entirely unambiguous, that the shot was going to happen, that the corridor was going to be in the frame, and that if Eddie's bosses had a problem with that, they were welcome to come down the floor and discuss it personally. It would later be agreed by everyone present, a catastrophic miscalculation on Eddie's part. Not because he had said no, but because he had gone back to report what Wayne had said verbatim. Because the Don was a man who responded very poorly to the phrase, "Come down and discuss it personally," when it came from someone he considered to be a guest in his establishment. It implied a kind of quality that the Don found deeply offensive. It suggested that the person saying it did not fully understand the nature of the arrangement they were operating within. And the Don felt, as he often did in these situations, that a personal demonstration of clarity was required. He came down to the casino floor himself. This was unusual. The Don was not a man who typically descended from his offices to handle operational matters. His presence on the floor was reserved for moments of genuine importance, and the fact that he made this appearance personally was, for those who understood the grammar of power in that room, a statement in itself. The staff straightened imperceptibly. The cocktail waitresses found reasons to be somewhere else. Even the gamblers, who were theoretically oblivious to everything except their cards, seemed to register some shift in the atmosphere, some change in the barometric pressure of the room. The Don walked across the floor with the unhurried confidence of a man who has never once had to hurry, because the things he wanted had always, eventually, come to him. He was accompanied by two associates who stayed far enough back to be deniable but close enough to matter. He was wearing a dark pinstripe suit and a hat that sat at an angle suggesting both elegance and menace. He found John Wayne standing beside the disputed camera position, arms crossed, watching the Don's approach with an expression that suggested he was mildly interested to see how this would play out. Dean Martin was at a blackjack table nearby. He was not playing. He was leaning against the table's edge with a glass of something amber-colored, watching the scene develop with those half-lit eyes of his. The eyes that always looked like they were either about to deliver the punchline or had already heard it. He had spent enough time in enough rooms like this to understand exactly what was happening. He also understood, with a clarity born of long experience, that there was precisely nothing he could do to stop it. The Don stopped a few feet from Wayne. He did not extend his hand. He looked at the camera. He looked at the corridor. He looked at Wayne. And then he said, in a voice designed to be heard only by the people immediately present and no one else, that he had been generous in allowing this production to use his facility, that his generosity had conditions, and that he expected those conditions to be respected. He said this without heat, without visible emotion, in the tone of a man reciting a fact that he considered entirely self-evident. Wayne looked at him for a moment. Those who were present would later describe the pause that followed as one of the most uncomfortable silences they had ever experienced. The entire casino floor seemed to slow. Cards were held mid-deal. Chips sat untouched. Even the constant ambient sound of the slot machines, that endless mechanical heartbeat, seemed to recede. And then Wayne said, slowly and with absolute conviction, that he was not interested in conditions, that he was making a film, that the shot was necessary, and that in his experience, when a man hit a doorway from a camera, it was because he had something to hide on the other side of it. The Don's face did a complicated thing. The men who were watching him, and there were several, positioned around the room with the studied casualness of people who are very carefully watching something, saw the moment when the carefully maintained surface of his composure developed a crack. It was not visible to everyone, but to the people who knew his face, who had spent years learning to read it the way sailors learn to read a sky. It was unmistakable. He leaned forward slightly. He began to say something, and John Wayne slapped him. Not a punch, not a shove, a slap, flat-handed, deliberate, the back of Wayne's right hand connecting with the side of the Don's face with sound that was somehow both sharp and muffled at the same time, like a gunshot heard through water. The Don's head snapped to one side. His hat tilted. For a fraction of a second, the entire casino floor existed in a state of suspended impossibility, a collective inability to process what had just occurred. Then everything exploded. Not literally, not guns, not yet, though that possibility would hover over the next several hours like a storm front. But the room erupted. The two associates moved forward instantly. Several staff members materialized from positions around the floor. Voices were raised. There was a sound of chairs being pushed back, of feet on carpet, of a glass breaking somewhere on the far side of the room. Dean Martin straightened up from the blackjack table with the expression of a man who has just seen the weather forecast prove catastrophically accurate. Wayne did not move. He stood exactly where he had been standing, watching the chaos cascade outward from the point where his hand had met the Don's face, with an expression that was not quite satisfaction and not quite regret, but somewhere between the two, like a man who has done the necessary thing, and is now simply waiting to see what it cost him. One of the associates, a broad, dark-haired man who would later be identified in federal records by a name that is not relevant here, grabbed Wayne's arm. This was, as those present would agree, a tactical error. Wayne's response was immediate, physical, and comprehensive. The associate went backward over a blackjack table in a way that scattered chips across the carpet and produced a sound that made several people in the vicinity wince. The second associate stopped where he was. He looked at the Don. He looked at Wayne. He made a calculation. The Don had straightened. His hat was back in place. His expression had returned to something approaching its usual carefully managed blankness, though anyone looking closely enough could see that the effort it was taking to maintain that blankness was somewhat greater than usual. There was something working in his eyes, not fear exactly, but its distant cousin, something that acknowledged, against every instinct and every piece of accumulated experience he possessed, that the man standing in front of him was genuinely, constitutionally unafraid of him, and that this was a problem he was not sure his usual tools could solve. Dean Martin crossed the floor. He moved without hurrying, which under the circumstances required a kind of controlled grace that very few people could have managed. He arrived at the center of the situation carrying his glass, his expression somewhere between a grin and a grimace, and he said, and this is a part that various witnesses remember with consistent, if sometimes embellished detail. He said something to the effect that perhaps everyone could agree it had been a very long day and that certain things might benefit from being discussed somewhere quieter. He said it in that voice of his, the voice that had always been able to do something to a room, smooth it like a hand across a rumpled tablecloth, and for a moment, just a moment, it seemed like it might work. The Don looked at Dean. There was history in that look, complicated history, the kind that accumulates between two people who have known each other across too many years and too many rooms. Dean had been useful to the Don's world. Dean was a part of that world in ways that were difficult to fully extract. And the Don recognized in the way Dean was standing there with his glass and his carefully modulated smile that his old acquaintance was performing a very delicate act of diplomacy, was attempting, with nothing but charm and force of personality, to prevent the next 20 minutes from becoming something that none of them wanted to deal with. Wayne was watching this exchange with his arms at his sides, his weight slightly forward, the posture of a man who has no intention of retreating but is willing, temporarily, to be still. The Don said nothing for what felt like a very long time. Then he said, addressing Dean and only Dean, that his property and his privacy were to be respected, that the production had 24 hours to complete whatever filming it required and vacate the premises, and that further discussion of any kind would be conducted through lawyers. He turned. He walked back across the casino floor. His associates followed. The staff resumed their positions with the practiced speed of people who have learned that the most professional thing they can do in the aftermath of an incident is to behave as though nothing has occurred. The gamblers, most of whom had witnessed everything, returned to their cards with the studied curiosity of people who understand that what they have just seen is not something they were meant to see. Dean Martin watched the Dons retreating back. He took a sip of his drink. He looked at Wayne, and he said quietly, without any particular emotion, "You know that's not over." Wayne looked back at him. "It is for today," he said. And that, for the moment, was that, except it wasn't. Because nothing that happens in a room like that, in a city like that, with men like those, is ever simply over. The ripples for what occurred on that Tuesday afternoon spread outward in ways that neither Wayne nor Martin could entirely anticipate, touching people and places and relationships that had nothing obvious to do with a slap on a casino floor. By that evening, the story was moving through Las Vegas at the speed that only genuinely extraordinary stories travel, which is to say, instantly. The details mutated as they spread, as details always do. In some versions, Wayne had thrown the Don across a table. In others, he had done it with a closed fist. In one particularly embellished account that was circulating in certain bars by midnight, Wayne had produced a firearm, which was not accurate but was, in the storytelling terms of the time and place, somehow satisfying. The kernel at the center of all these versions was the same. John Wayne had put his hands on a man who had, for decades, operated with the assurance that no one would dare, and the world was trying to figure out what that meant. What it meant, in immediate practical terms, was that a series of phone calls were being made. The kind of phone calls that left no record and were described in no documentation, but that set in motion a series of events with the precision and inevitability of a row of falling dominoes. People in Chicago were being informed. People in New York were being informed. Certain conversations that had been proceeding in one direction were being reconsidered. The Don, whatever his personal feelings about the afternoon's events, operated within a structure that had opinions about these things, and those opinions were being sought. John Wayne, for his part, was not hiding. This was perhaps what most confounded the people trying to decide what to do about him. He was not difficult to find. He was not behaving like a man who understood the possible consequences of what he had done. He was at dinner at a restaurant not far from the casino, eating a steak, apparently relaxed, apparently unconcerned. Several people who passed through the restaurant that evening later recalled seeing him there and being struck by this. There was something either very brave or very stupid about it, and none of them could quite determine which. Dean Martin did not go to dinner. Dean Martin went somewhere quieter, made several phone calls of his own, and spent several hours navigating a situation that he would describe years later, in an interview that touched only glancingly on the details, as the kind of evening that reminds you why it's good to know people. What Dean was doing, in those hours, was using the accumulated currency of decades of carefully maintained relationships to argue, quietly, persistently, with the patient skill of someone who has negotiated in these registers many times before, that the incident should be allowed to pass. That John Wayne was John Wayne. That the production would leave as scheduled. That the Don had not, technically speaking, been injured. And that the kind of attention that would follow any escalation was a kind of attention that nobody in this particular ecosystem wanted or could afford. This argument was not simple. It required Dean to acknowledge certain things about his own position, to call in certain obligations, and make certain implicit guarantees about future behavior that he was not entirely confident he could deliver. It required him to spend several hours in rooms and on phone lines having conversations that were, in the diplomatic tradition of all such conversations, entirely about one thing while ostensibly being about something else entirely. It also required, at one point, a direct conversation with the Don himself. This conversation took place in the Don's offices above the casino floor. Dean came alone, which was itself a statement of trust, or at minimum, of the willingness to demonstrate trust. The Don's offices were not what most people would have imagined. They were not dramatic or opulent. They were businesslike. There were filing cabinets. There was a desk with papers on it. There were no visible weapons and no visible threats, which everyone present understood to be its own kind of statement. The Don was behind his desk when Dean came in. He looked, Dean would later recall, like a man who was tired. Not physically tired, but tired in the deeper sense. The way a man looks when he's been doing a very demanding job for a very long time. Dean sat down. He did not begin with pleasantries. He looked at the Don and said, with the directness that he typically kept concealed beneath his charm, that he understood the Don's position, that he respected it, and that he was asking, as a personal favor from one old friend to another, to let the matter go. He said that Wayne was not part of the world they moved in, that he didn't understand it, and that in this particular case, his ignorance should be treated as a form of innocence. He said that the production would finish and leave. He said that the corridor, the doorway, the whatever it was the Don was protecting, that none of it had made it into the cameras, and that none of it would. The Don listened to all of this without expression. Then he said that John Wayne was a famous man. That famous men sometimes believed that their fame gave them a kind of immunity that it did not actually give them. He said this not as a threat, exactly, but as an observation, the kind of observation that, coming from this man, in this room, carried within it the shadow of every implication. Dean nodded. He understood. He said he did not disagree. He said he was asking. Nonetheless, there was a long silence. The kind of silence that in another context might have been meditative, but in this context had weight and texture and the quiet pressure of a great many unspoken things pressing against its surface. Then the Don made a gesture, small, dismissive, the motion of a man setting something aside rather than resolving it, and said that the production could have its 24 hours, that he expected there'd be no further disruptions, and that he would consider the matter concluded. Dean stood. He thanked the Don, and in doing so walked the extremely narrow line between genuine gratitude and the kind of gratitude that acknowledges a debt, because in these negotiations, gratitude and obligation were very nearly the same thing. He left the office. He went downstairs. He went back to the bar. He ordered a drink. And then, because Dean Martin was at his core a man who processed the world through performance, he sat there at the bar and he sang, under his breath, a few bars of something slow and sweet and deeply melancholy, to nobody in particular, in the middle of the night, in a casino in the desert. John Wayne finished his steak. He went back to the production hotel. And the next morning, he showed up on the casino floor exactly as scheduled, in costume, ready to work, giving every appearance of a man who had spent a perfectly ordinary evening. He walked past the now fully permitted camera position near the corridor. He hit his marks. He delivered his lines. He did all of this with a professional precision and total lack of apparent self-consciousness that was one of the remarkable constants of his working life. The ability to appear in front of the camera as though absolutely nothing existed outside the frame. The scenes were filmed. The production wrapped. The crew packed their equipment and left the casino, and Las Vegas resumed its perpetual present tense. The city that is always and only exactly now, that has no interest in what happened yesterday, and no particular investment in tomorrow either. But the story did not stop there. Stories like this one never stop where they appear to stop. They continue underground, moving through different material, surfacing in unexpected places years later. What nobody on that production understood, what Wayne himself almost certainly did not fully understand, was what had actually been on the other side of that corridor. The details would emerge, partially and obliquely, in the years that followed, in testimony given during federal investigations into organized crime's influence in Nevada, in documents that were declassified, in interviews given by people who had reason to finally speak. The corridor led not just to the Don's offices, but to a secondary set of rooms used for a specific purpose that had nothing to do with casino operations and everything to do with the financial architecture of a criminal enterprise that stretched across most of the continental United States. Had those rooms been captured on film? Even incidentally, even in the background of the shot, the implications would have been, in the language favored by federal investigators, significant. What Wayne had stumbled into, without knowing it, was not simply a territorial dispute about camera positions. He had stumbled into the outer edge of something much larger, and his refusal to be redirected, his complete inability to accept a boundary without demanding to know the reason for it, had brought him within an accidental step of exposing something that very powerful people had invested a great deal in concealing. Whether the slap was, in some obscure way, the Don's attempt to create a scene that would justify stopping the filming entirely, to manufacture a conflict that would give him grounds to remove production from his premises without exposing the real reason, is something that was speculated about then and has been speculated about since. The Don was not a stupid man. He was, by every account, the opposite of a stupid man. And the escalation from floor manager to personal appearance to a confrontation with John Wayne on a Tuesday afternoon has, to those who think about these things carefully, the shape of a plan rather than an improvisation. If so, it worked or nearly worked. The production left. The footage that was captured was eventually edited in ways that made the corridor irrelevant. The film was made, released, and added to the long list of projects that was not among anyone involved's finest work. And the story of what had happened on that casino floor receded into the categories of Hollywood legend. The kind of thing that gets told at parties and in retrospectives, and in exactly the kind of long-form video you're watching right now. But there is one more piece of the story, and it is, in many ways, the most important. Several months after production had ended, John Wayne received a letter. It was hand-delivered, not through any postal service, by a man who knocked on the door of Wayne's ranch and handed it over without a word and left without waiting for any response. The letter was unsigned. It was brief, and it said in language that was both courteous and crystalline that the matter of the casino had been noted, that certain conclusions had been drawn, and that Wayne would be well advised to be careful in his future dealings with certain categories of enterprise. Wayne read this letter. He read it twice. Then he folded it, put it in his desk drawer, and went back to whatever he had been doing before it arrived. He kept the letter. It was found among his papers after his death. What is perhaps most remarkable about the entire episode is not the slap itself, not the confrontation, not even the diplomatic maneuvering that Dean Martin performed in the hours that followed. What is most remarkable is the conversation that Wayne and Martin had, quietly, over drinks, the evening after production wrapped and before they both left Las Vegas. This conversation is known because Dean Martin described it, in general terms, to a small number of people over the years, and some of those people eventually described it to others. Dean asked Wayne why he had done it, not angrily, not with any judgment, just with genuine curiosity. The curiosity of a man who had grown up learning when to push and when to accommodate, asking a man who seemed to have never learned the second half of that lesson. And Wayne said, and this is the part that stays with you, that there is something worse than being hurt, that being handled, being managed and maneuvered and redirected by people who rely on your cooperation, is a form of being disappeared, that the man with the corridor and the conditions and the carefully worded ultimatums was not interested in an arrangement. He was interested in an acknowledgement of power. And Wayne said that he had decided, a long time ago, that he would rather have an honest conflict with a man than a dishonest peace. Dean looked at him for a long moment, and then he said something that has been repeated in various forms in the retellings, but whose essential shape seems consistent. He said that there was something genuinely admirable about that, and also something genuinely exhausting about it, and that he wasn't sure he had the energy for it himself. He said he preferred to find the door. Wayne said that sometimes there was no door. Dean raised his glass. Then sometimes, he said, you walk through the wall. They finished their drinks. They said goodnight. And two of the most famous men in American entertainment separated on a sidewalk in Las Vegas, walking in different directions into the warm desert night. Each of them carrying the evening's events the way they carried everything. Wayne with the solidity of a man who keeps his accounts balanced and his ledger clear. Dean with the lightness of a man who has learned that the best way to carry a heavy thing is to pretend it doesn't weigh anything at all. The Don continued to operate his casino for another several years before the federal government's expanding investigation made his position, and the positions of many men like him, untenable. He was eventually indicted on a range of charges whose specific details are a matter of public record. He lived for a long time afterward, long enough to see the city he had helped build transformed into something he wouldn't have recognized. Whether he ever thought about that Tuesday afternoon is not recorded anywhere. Dean Martin continued to be Dean Martin, which is to say, he continued to fill rooms with something that felt like warmth and ease, and particular grace of man who has made peace with the world's fundamental disorder. He performed in Las Vegas for decades more. He never, in any public forum, mentioned what had happened that afternoon, or the evening that followed it, or the conversations he had conducted in the Don's offices above the casino floor. He took it with him, the way he took so many things, lightly, gracefully, irrevocably. John Wayne made more films than can be conveniently counted. He won his Oscar. He battled cancer with the same straight-ahead determination he applied to everything else. He remained, until the end, a man who occupied space with a kind of absolute certainty that was either inspiring or infuriating depending on your perspective and which side of his hand you happened to be on. He never talked about that afternoon in terms that would have confirmed or denied any specific detail. But in one interview, given toward the end of his life, he was asked about the quality he most valued in a person. He thought for a moment, and then he said, "The willingness to stand in a room full of people who want you to leave and simply refuse to leave." The interviewer laughed, assuming this was an abstraction, a philosophical position. Wayne smiled and said nothing more. There are moments in history that sound too cinematic to be real. And then you realize that cinema itself was invented precisely to capture the moments that reality produces, which no one would otherwise believe. A casino floor in Las Vegas. A man in a leather vest. A sound like thunder in a quiet room. And somewhere to the side, holding a glass and watching it all happen, a man with a half-smile who understood exactly what he was witnessing and who would spend the rest of the evening making sure it cost as little as possible. This is what it looked like when two different philosophies about how to survive in the world collided in front of a blackjack table on a Tuesday afternoon. One philosophy said, "Find the door, use the charm, make the peace, live to sing another day." The other said, "If the room tries to make you smaller than you are, remind it what size you actually are." Neither philosophy is entirely right. Neither is entirely wrong. Both of them, in their own way, worked. Both of these men walked out of that casino under their own power, which is more than can be said for plenty of people who found themselves on the wrong side of the men who owned that floor. But only one of them walked out having done something that nobody in that city had ever done before. And in a place where everything had a price, where every favor was a loan and every kindness was a contract, where the entire architecture power depended on everyone understanding that there were things you simply did not do. In that place, on that afternoon, John Wayne walked in, looked at the architecture, and knocked a piece of it sideways with the back of his hand. The walls didn't come down. Buildings like that don't come down from one slap, but they leaned. And sometimes a lean is enough